At exactly 11:17 p.m., beneath the largest chandelier in Seoul, Kate Harte did something that should have gotten her killed. She lifted a heavy...
The ballroom went silent. Water exploded across his face and soaked through his tuxedo, sending his carefully combed hair sliding over his forehead.
His guards reached beneath their jackets. Kate saw the weapons come out. She also saw the thin red line trembling against his soaked shirt, climbing slowly toward his throat.
Glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the marble before it hit the floor. 300 guests, billionaires and politicians, and men who never had to explain themselves to anyone, stared in open disbelief as a poor waitress stood in front of him, still gripping the empty pitcher like a weapon. His guards reached beneath their jackets. Kate saw the weapons come out. She also saw the thin red line trembling against his soaked shirt, climbing slowly toward his throat. "Get down!" she screamed. A suppressed gunshot cracked through the ballroom before the words had fully left her mouth. The bullet passed through the space where his head had been and buried itself in the marble column behind him. Guests screamed. Chairs went over. Somewhere near the back, a man lowered his phone calmly and began walking toward the exit, while everyone else scrambled the opposite direction. Security tackled Kate to the floor before she could say a single word in her own defense. But Dong-Yul touched the back of his neck, found the graze the bullet had left there, looked down at the broken glass by his feet, and gave an order that stunned every person still standing in that room. Nobody touches her. 10 days earlier, Kate Harte had been nothing more than an invisible waitress, struggling to pay her mother's hospital bill. If you're watching this from the United States, from Lagos, from Seoul, from London, or from anywhere else in the world tonight, drop your city in the comments before the story continues, because I would genuinely love to say hello and know how far along this story is finding you. You're going to need every bit of courage you have for what happens next. Kate Harte had learned, a long time ago, that the safest place in any room was the corner nobody looked at. At the Hansong Grand Hotel, that corner belonged to her. 10-hour shifts stretched into 14 whenever a wedding ran long or a conference overbooked the ballroom, and Kate absorbed the extra hours the way she absorbed everything else, quietly, without complaint, because complaint had never once made her life easier. She was the waitress managers requested by name when something needed to go right, without anyone noticing the effort behind it. She refilled water glasses before they were empty. She remembered which diplomats disliked garlic, and which actresses wanted their champagne poured without a single bubble spilling over the rim. Guests rarely looked at her long enough to learn her name, and Kate had stopped minding. Being unseen, she had discovered, was its own kind of survival. Beneath her pressed black uniform, her shoes were a year past worn through, the soles thin to something closer to memory than leather. She kept them polished anyway. Everything about her appearance had to look expensive, even when nothing she owned was. Almost every one she earned in tips went into a folder in her kitchen drawer, a folder that grew thinner every month, no matter how carefully she divided it. Hospital co-payments, medication refills, the physical therapist her mother's insurance only partly covered. Kate had once wanted to be the one prescribing that medication herself. She'd gotten 2 years into an emergency medicine program before her mother's health took a sudden, frightening turn, and the bills that followed swallowed the tuition money whole. Kate withdrew from school the same week she picked up her first double shift at the Hansong. She told herself it was temporary. 4 years later, the word still hadn't stopped being a lie she needed to believe. Her father's death, years before any of that, had taught her the rest of what she knew about survival. Samuel Harte had been a careful man, a financial auditor who kept his ties straight and his questions to himself, until, near the end, he stopped keeping them to himself. Kate had been 18 then, old enough to notice the sudden late nights, the locked drawer in his study, the way he'd started glancing at parked cars a beat too long before crossing the street. He never told her what he'd found. He only told her, the last time she saw him, that some truths cost more than a person could survive paying. 3 weeks later he was gone, and the police called it an accident, and Kate had never once believed them. What she believed instead was the lesson underneath it. Silence kept you alive, and noise got you killed. She had built the 11 years since around that single, unbending rule. She had seen the name Nae once before, long before that, at 16, curious and foolish enough to go looking through the locked drawer her father thought she didn't know about. She remembered the weight of the folder in her hands, the columns of numbers that meant nothing to her at the time, and the word NAA stamped across the top of a customs form in blue ink. She'd put it back and never mentioned it. Some part of her, even at 16, had understood that the folder was the reason her father checked the locks twice every night. So when her manager gathered the staff in the service hallway on a gray Tuesday morning and announced, in the hushed voice usually reserved for royalty or funerals, that the hotel would be hosting a private midnight gala for Nae Dong-Yul, Kate felt the old instinct rise in her chest before she understood why. "You do not initiate eye contact," her manager said, reading from a printed sheet, as though the words might otherwise escape him. "You do not speak unless spoken to. If Mr. Nae's staff gives an instruction, you follow it immediately, no matter who gave the instruction before it." He looked up. "This is the most important booking this hotel has hosted in a decade. Nobody makes a mistake." She should have felt afraid, hearing the name spoken aloud in a hotel hallway again after all this time. Instead, what she felt first, before the fear caught up with her, was the shape of a number. A midnight gala meant triple shifts and private event gratuities, the kind of single night that could cover an entire month of her mother's treatment, if she worked it right. Kate raised her hand and volunteered for the assignment before her manager finished asking for volunteers. She told herself the folder was ancient history. She told herself a name in a dead man's paperwork meant nothing, that Seoul was full of Naes the way any city was full of common names, that her father's death and a hotel booking had no more connection than two unrelated stars in the same sky. She told herself this all the way through the 2 days of preparation, through the polishing of 200 crystal glasses, through the laying of gold-threaded tablecloths across 40 round tables. She was still telling herself this when the motorcade arrived. 3 black SUVs came to a stop beneath the hotel's front canopy, in a single unbroken line, doors opening in practiced synchrony before the engines had fully quieted. Men in dark suits stepped out first, scanning the entrance with the flat, unblinking attention of people paid to expect danger everywhere. Kate watched from just inside the lobby doors, a tray of welcome champagne balanced against her palm, and felt the entire staff around her go still, in a way that had nothing to do with training. Nae Dong-Yul stepped out last. He was younger than Kate expected, late 30s, not the silver-haired patriarch the stories implied, and he moved like a man who had never once needed to hurry. His tuxedo was cut so precisely, it seemed to have been made around his body rather than fitted to it afterward, and an expensive silver watch caught the light each time he lifted his wrist. His face gave away nothing. Kate had waited tables for men who radiated cruelty before they said a single word, and she braced herself for the same performance now. It didn't come. Instead, as one of his guards muttered something sharp to an elderly cleaning woman who had accidentally blocked the entrance with her cart, Dong-Yul lifted 2 fingers, barely a gesture, and the guard fell silent instantly. Dong-Yul murmured something too low for Kate to hear, and the old woman was allowed to finish moving her cart in peace, calm and unafraid. It lasted 3 seconds. Kate doubted anyone else in the lobby had noticed it happen at all. She noticed, and for reasons she couldn't yet name, it unsettled her more than outright cruelty would have. Cruelty she understood. Cruelty fit the shape of everything she'd been warned to expect. This small, almost accidental mercy, fit nothing. As if he'd felt her watching, Dong-Yul's gaze crossed the lobby and found her. Kate lowered her eyes the way she'd been trained to, a half-second too late to seem natural, and she felt rather than saw him notice the delay. He didn't linger on it. He simply moved past her, toward the private elevator bank, his attention already elsewhere. The man beside him did not move on so quickly. "Miss Harte," he said her name from her name badge, not from memory, though something in his tone suggested he'd already made a note of her regardless. He was slim, precise, dressed in charcoal that made no attempt to compete with Dong-Yul's tuxedo. Park Jin-suk, chief of staff to Mr. Nae. His smile arrived and departed with mechanical accuracy. You'll be assigned to the private floor tonight. Please make yourself useful, and please make yourself forgettable. It should have sounded like an insult. It landed, instead, like an instruction Kate had already spent her whole life following. She nodded and said nothing, and Park's eyes stayed on her a beat longer than the exchange required, before he turned to follow his employer. Kate didn't know, delivering coffee to the private floor an hour later, that Dong-Yul had shut himself into the smaller of the two meeting rooms, with a woman in a dark trouser suit who signed the visitor log under a name that wasn't her own. Kate didn't know that the woman was a prosecutor, or that she carried a recording device stitched into the lining of her coat, or that Dong-Yul had told her, in a voice low enough to vanish beneath the hum of the air conditioning, that the gala would be his only chance. Everything moves that night, he said. After that, there won't be another opportunity. Not for me. Kate didn't know that Park Jin-suk stood on the other side of that wall with a small device pressed to his ear, recording every word for a man Dong-Yul trusted least of anyone alive. All Kate knew, delivering her tray and retreating without a second glance from anyone in that hallway, was that something about the entire floor felt wrong, in a way she couldn't yet describe. A held breath running underneath the marble and the gold leaf, waiting for a reason to release. She found her reason 2 nights later, in a corridor she had no business being in. It was nearly midnight, and Kate had gone back for a forgotten tray of water glasses left behind after a private planning meeting on the restricted service level, the level reserved for senior staff, and, for the past 2 days, for Nae Dong-Yul's people exclusively. She wasn't supposed to be there after hours. She told herself she'd be in and out in under a minute. She heard Park's voice before she reached the storage room, drifting low through a door left open no more than a hand's width. At 11:17, he was saying, in a level, unconcerned tone he might have used to confirm a dinner reservation, the black dragon stops breathing. Kate froze mid-step, the empty tray suddenly heavy in her hands. There was a pause, someone answering on the other end, too quiet for Kate to catch, and then Park continued, laying out details the way a man lays out a schedule. The northern window. A particular champagne glass, already marked, already prepared. A backup signal, to be used only if the first plan failed. If it goes wrong, Park said, almost bored, the waitress takes the blame. We've already built the story. Nobody looks past an angry service worker with a grudge. Kate's mouth went dry. She thought, absurdly, of every waitress on the floor that night, wondering which one of them Park meant, wondering if she should feel relief that it might not be her. Then Park said something that made the relief evaporate entirely. The Harte woman, he said. Yes, her father's file is still open. It won't be difficult to make it look like revenge. The tray slipped half an inch in Kate's hands before she caught it, and the rim struck the corridor wall with a small, unmistakable clink. Silence fell on the other side of the door. Kate didn't wait to hear what came next. She turned and moved, soundless in her worn-through shoes, into the narrow linen closet 3 steps away, easing the door shut just as she heard Park's footsteps cross the storage room floor. She pressed herself into the dark between 2 shelves of folded tablecloths, one hand clamped over her own mouth, and listened to him step into the corridor, pause, and crouch. A single drop of water, shaken loose from her forgotten tray, glistened on the marble where she'd been standing seconds before. She watched, through the narrow gap between the closet door and its frame, as Park studied that drop for 3 long seconds, long enough that Kate's lungs began to burn from holding her breath, before straightening, glancing once down the empty corridor, and walking away without another word. Kate didn't move for nearly a full minute after his footsteps faded. When she finally did, she went the opposite direction, through a laundry passage that fed into the loading dock, out into the cold night air, where she allowed herself, finally, to shake. Her hands trembled so badly it took her 3 attempts to unlock her phone. She'd started recording the moment she recognized Park's voice, an old habit from her emergency medicine program, capturing lectures she'd been too exhausted to fully absorb the first time, and she played it back now with her back against the loading dock wall, the same wall her father had once told her, in a different life, never to trust completely. The recording was almost nothing, 12 seconds of Park's voice, garbled by distance and the hum of a nearby generator, cutting off entirely before the word Harte. Not enough to prove anything, not enough to convince anyone who didn't already believe her. She saved it anyway, in a folder she labeled with nothing at all. But it was enough for Kate to understand, standing alone in the cold with her heart still hammering, that her father's death and the gala pressing toward its opening in 48 hours were not two separate stars in the sky after all. They had always been the same one. She reported what she'd heard to her manager the next morning, choosing her words as carefully as she'd ever chosen anything in her life. He listened for exactly as long as politeness required, before his expression closed like a door. "Do you understand what you're accusing his staff of?" he said, glancing past her toward the lobby, as though the walls themselves might be listening. "This booking is worth more than this hotel's entire fourth quarter. If you repeat this to a single other person, a guest, a journalist, anyone, you will not just lose your position here, you will make an enemy of a very powerful organization, over a partial recording nobody can verify." He softened, briefly, into something almost like concern. "Let it go, Kate, please. For your own sake." She tried a junior security officer next, a young man barely older than she was, and watched the same dismissiveness settle over his face before she'd finished her second sentence. He suggested, not unkindly, that stress could make a person hear things that weren't quite there. Park Jin-seok found her that afternoon, alone near the staff elevators, and Kate understood, the instant she saw him, that this had never been a matter of whether he knew someone had overheard him. It had only ever been a matter of when he'd decide to let her know that he knew. "Miss Harte." His voice carried the same courteous, unbothered tone it always did. "I understand you spoke with your manager this morning." Kate said nothing. Her pulse climbed anyway. "I want to be sure there's no misunderstanding between us," Park continued, studying her with the mild, patient interest of a man examining something he already fully owned. "Your mother receives treatment at Seoul National, doesn't she? Ward 6. I believe her next appointment is Thursday." He let the silence stretch just long enough for the weight of it to land. It would be a shame for anything to interrupt her care. Illness is difficult enough without additional stress. He walked away before Kate could answer, and she stood frozen by the elevators for a long time afterward, understanding with sudden, sickening clarity that silence, the rule she had built her entire adult life around, had just stopped being a form of safety. It had become, instead, exactly what Park was counting on. The photograph appeared in her locker 2 days later, her mother, taken from across the street outside the hospital, time-stamped that same morning. Kate's hands didn't shake this time. They'd gone past shaking into something colder and steadier. Someone had gone through her belongings. She found her spare uniform refolded wrong, her locked drawer of tip envelopes disturbed. Her phone vanished from the staff break room for 20 minutes and came back with the screen slightly warm, as though it had recently been in use. By evening, false messages had begun surfacing under her name in a hotel employee forum. Kate ranting about wealthy men who thought they owned everyone beneath them. Kate promising to make Nae Dong-Yul regret ever setting foot in her hotel. She had written none of it. It read, horribly, exactly like something she might have written if she'd ever allowed herself to say any of it out loud. That night, sitting at her mother's bedside with the photograph folded small in her pocket, Kate said, quietly, that maybe it was time to leave Seoul, somewhere smaller. Somewhere no one would recognize either of their names. Her mother, Evelyn, thin and tired against the pillows but still sharper than anyone gave her credit for, reached over and took Kate's hand. "Running didn't save your father," she said. "It only bought him 3 more weeks of being afraid before it happened anyway." Her grip tightened, frail but certain. "I would rather you were careful, Kate. I would rather you weren't foolish. But I don't want you to spend your whole life becoming smaller, so that men like this never have to notice you exist. Kate didn't sleep that night.
By morning, she had stopped asking herself whether to keep investigating and started asking herself how. The opportunity arrived disguised as an ordinary coffee delivery. Dong-Yul's temporary office occupied a converted suite on the private floor, and Kate had carried a tray to that door a dozen times without incident.
This time, the assistant who usually intercepted deliveries at the threshold was absent, and Kate found herself standing alone in the doorway of a room stacked with document boxes, one of them left carelessly open on the desk. She saw her father's name before she'd consciously decided to look for it. Samuel Harte, typed across the header of an old shipping manifest, the same kind of form she remembered from the folder in his locked drawer years earlier. Kate set the tray down without thinking and lifted the page, and she was still holding it, hands trembling, when Dong-Yul walked in behind her. "That doesn't belong to you," he said, not sharp, almost tired. Kate turned to face him, and whatever fear should have stopped her simply didn't arrive in time. "You knew my father," she said. "You had a file on him. Did you kill him?" The words came out steadier than she felt, steadier than she had any right to feel, standing alone in a room with a man half the country was afraid to look at directly. "Did you have him killed?" For a long moment, Dong-Yul only looked at her. Then he crossed the room, closed the door, and told the two guards waiting outside to leave the floor entirely. "Sit down, Miss Harte," he said, and when Kate didn't move, he continued anyway, as though her stillness were answer enough. "Your father discovered something he was never meant to find. My uncle, Kang Tae-sik, was using our shipping companies to move weapons and launder money through routes that were supposed to carry nothing but freight. Samuel found the discrepancy in the manifests before anyone else did. He was careful. He was also braver than careful men are usually allowed to be." Kate's fingers tightened around the page still clutched in her hand. "You're telling me you didn't do it. I'm telling you I tried to stop it." Something moved behind Dong-Yul's controlled expression, brief and unguarded. "I was young. I didn't have the authority I have now, but I arranged transportation to get him out of the country before my uncle could act. A route, papers, a window of 2 days." He paused. "Someone leaked that route to Kang before Samuel ever reached the port." "Who?" Dong-Yul didn't answer immediately, and something in his silence told Kate he already suspected the answer far more specifically than he was willing to say aloud. "Your father was killed at Incheon," he said instead. "I have spent a great deal of my life believing that failure was mine to carry." He crossed to the desk, unlocked a drawer, and withdrew a slim folder Kate hadn't noticed among the boxes, pages of encrypted text, columns of numbers that meant nothing without a key to unlock them. "This is what your father built before he died," Dong-Yul said. "An encrypted ledger. Names, transactions, everything Kang has spent 30 years hiding. I have the data. I have never had the key to open it. Samuel built the encryption himself, and whatever he used to unlock it disappeared the night he died. I have carried this folder for over a decade without being able to read a single line of it." Kate stared at the folder, then at him, and felt the old rule rise in her one more time. Say nothing, trust nothing. Powerful men destroy anyone who gets close enough to see them clearly. And for the first time in 11 years, she wasn't entirely certain the rule still applied to the man standing in front of her. She didn't tell him that. "I don't trust you," she said instead, which was, at least, the truth. "I wouldn't ask you to." Dong-Yul's gaze moved, briefly, to the thin gold chain visible at her collar, the small pendant resting just beneath it, the one her father had given her the week before he died, the one he'd told her, in the same breath as his warning about truths too costly to survive, never to take off. Something flickered behind Dong-Yul's eyes. He said nothing about it. He only looked away again, as though he'd noticed nothing at all. Neither of them knew that 2 floors below, in a security office lined with monitor screens, Park Jin-suk sat forward in his chair, pausing the footage from the hallway camera outside Dong-Yul's office. He zoomed in, slowly, on the small pendant glinting at Kate Harte's throat, and allowed himself something close to a smile, the first genuine one he'd worn in days. Han Min-sok found Kate standing in front of the ballroom security map 2 days before the gala, close enough to the wall-mounted schematic that he assumed, correctly, she had been studying it for longer than a passing glance required. "You have no reason to be looking at this." His voice was clipped, no nonsense, the voice of a man who had spent 2 decades making people regret ignoring him. Up close, he was built like a door, broad, solid, immovable, with a small scar tracing the edge of his jaw that Kate suspected had a story behind it he'd never volunteer. "Explain yourself." Kate had spent the last week learning exactly how little her explanations were worth to the people paid to protect Nae Dong-Yul. She gave this one anyway, because she was running out of people left to try. She told him about the corridor, about Park's voice through the half-open door, about the northern window and the champagne glass, and the backup signal, about her own surname spoken like the answer to a problem someone else had already solved. She told him about the messages she hadn't written, the photograph in her locker, the 20 minutes her phone had spent somewhere it shouldn't have been. Han listened without a flicker of belief crossing his face, and when she finished, he told her, in the same clipped tone, to stay away from restricted areas for the remainder of the event, and walked away without another word. He did not, however, forget what she'd said. By the following morning, Han had quietly confirmed that a catering employee scheduled for gala service, a man with 15 years on the hotel's payroll, had been replaced 2 days earlier by someone new, someone whose paperwork had been approved without the usual background review. He found a maintenance log showing a rooftop access door propped open under an authorization code that traced back to Park Jin-sok's credentials, though no maintenance had been scheduled. He learned, almost by accident, that Dong-Yul's regular driver had been hospitalized that week with a sudden, violent stomach illness that had come on within an hour of eating a meal prepared in the estate kitchen. None of it, alone, meant anything. Together, it meant Han made a call to a number he kept memorized, rather than saved, and told the woman who answered, Prosecutor Yoon Soo-ah, that something inside Nae Dong-Yul's own house had started rotting from the inside. Kate saw Park twice more before the gala. The first time, he was standing near the loading dock, in quiet conversation, with a man she didn't recognize, a man carrying a long, hard-shelled case that didn't match the champagne deliveries and floral arrangements coming through the same entrance all week. The second time, Park was in Dong-Yul's office, telling his employer, in the mild, matter-of-fact voice he reserved for delivering bad news, as though it were a weather report, that the Harte woman had been overheard making threats against the family, that she'd been caught searching restricted files, that her behavior suggested an attempt to extort the organization using a decade-old grudge dressed up as concern. Dong-Yul listened to all of it, with the same unreadable stillness Kate had noticed the first day he arrived, and told Park he would handle the matter personally. He ordered Kate removed from gala floor duty, reassigned to the farthest section of the ballroom, effective immediately. What Park did not hear, because Dong-Yul made certain of it, was the second, quieter instruction he gave Han an hour later. Keep her inside the building, keep her alive, and keep Park from knowing that I've noticed anything is wrong at all. Park, satisfied, returned to the loading dock that evening and gave the man with the case his final instructions. Prepare both plans, he said, the primary and the backup. By midnight tomorrow, one of them would work. The gala began the way every gala at the Hansong began, golden light pouring down from chandeliers the size of small cars, an orchestra tuning itself into something warm and unhurried, 300 of the country's wealthiest and most dangerous people arriving in a slow current of black tuxedos and jewel-toned gowns. Kate moved through her assigned section near the back of the ballroom, farther from Dong-Yul's table than she had been at any point in the week, and told herself that distance, for once, might be a mercy. At the head of the room, Dong-Yul counted down toward midnight, with the stillness of a man already bracing for a verdict. Prosecutor Yoon had already arrived, disguised in the borrowed identity of an investment advisor. a recording device, stitched somewhere Kate would never see. At the stroke of 12, Dong-Yul intended to hand her the still-locked ledger he'd carried for years, unreadable without a key he no longer expected to find, but enough, he'd decided, to begin the unraveling, even if it wasn't enough to finish it. Kate didn't know any of that. What she knew, watching from her distant post, was that a waiter near the kitchen doors had just staggered sideways after brushing his bare hand against a champagne tray, catching himself against a table before a colleague steadied him and helped him toward the service exit, his face gone pale and slick with sudden sweat. Kate had spent 2 years training to recognize exactly that kind of reaction. Dizziness, sudden pallor, the particular unsteadiness of a nervous system receiving a signal it wasn't built to survive. She started moving before she'd finished deciding to, cutting across the ballroom floor toward Dong-Yul's table, and made it exactly 11 steps before a guard's arm closed across her path, like a gate swinging shut. "Not tonight," he said, and didn't move again. She tried twice more from different angles, and was blocked both times, the guards rotating between her and Dong-Yul's table, with the practiced ease of men following an order they didn't need explained. Across the room, near the rooftop-facing windows, Han Min-sok discovered that the northern security camera, the one covering the maintenance access Park had quietly authorized days earlier, had frozen on a single static frame nearly 10 minutes ago. The orchestra swelled into something grander as midnight approached. Park moved through the crowd with a champagne flute he never drank from, positioning himself near the room's edge, and lifted his phone to his ear in a gesture so ordinary that not a single guest around him gave it a second glance. Dong-Yul rose from his seat. A fresh glass of champagne, the one Park had ensured reached his table, poured from a bottle no other guest had been offered, waited at his fingertips. Kate, still 11 feet from the nearest clear path to him, lifted the silver water pitcher she'd carried through the crowd, out of habit more than purpose, and in its polished curve, she saw a small red point of light tremble against the fabric of Dong-Yul's white shirt. It slid, slow and deliberate, toward his collar, toward his throat. Dong-Yul raised the glass toward his lips. Kate ran. She didn't remember deciding to. She remembered only the blur of gold tablecloths and startled faces, the outraged gasp of a woman whose chair she clipped, a man's arm thrown up in reflexive protest as she shoved past him without apology, the pitcher heavy and cold against her palms, 3 liters of water sloshing violently with every stride. She didn't have time to shout a warning that would mean anything before the trigger was pulled. She had time for exactly one thing. She reached him as the champagne touched his lips, gripped the pitcher with both hands, and threw the entire contents across his face and chest in a single violent arc. The impact staggered him sideways, the shock of cold, the sheer force of it, and his whole body twisted away from the water in pure animal reflex, head snapping down and to the left, exactly as a suppressed bullet split the air, where his throat had been a half-second earlier, and buried itself in the marble column 6 feet behind him, with a sound like a hammer striking stone. The champagne glass fell from his hand and shattered against the floor. For 1 full second, the ballroom did not move at all. Then it broke apart entirely. Guests screamed and scrambled from their chairs, tables overturning, as people dropped beneath them on pure instinct. Someone's dropped tray of glasses, shattering somewhere in the chaos, like a second gunshot. Han was already moving, crossing the room in a dead sprint toward a man near the eastern doors who had drawn a weapon from beneath his jacket, tackling him to the floor before he could raise it fully. 2 of Dong-Yul's guards seized Kate from behind, wrestling her down onto the marble hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs, one knee driving into her spine while she gasped, soaked and freezing, and tried to explain something no one around her was interested in hearing. Through the chaos, she caught one last glimpse of Park Jin-sok. Not fleeing in panic like everyone else, but walking, calm and composed, toward a service exit at the room's edge, the phone already lowered from his ear. Prosecutor Yoon, still disguised among the fleeing guests, used the same chaos to slip unnoticed toward a side corridor, the recording device stitched into her coat, capturing every second of it. He isn't surprised, Kate thought, pinned to the floor with a stranger's knee grinding into her back. He's the only person in this entire room who isn't surprised. Dong-Yul, soaked and disoriented, pressed a hand to the back of his own neck, and only then felt the raw graze where the bullet had passed close enough to burn skin without breaking it. He turned, following the guard's hold on Kate, and his eyes found the column behind his former seat, the small, unmistakable crater punched into the marble at precisely the height his head had occupied a moment earlier. Nobody touches her. They released Kate immediately, and she rose onto her knees, drenched and shaking, staring up at the man she had just doused in front of 300 witnesses, none of them yet understanding what she'd actually done. Park did not linger to watch the aftermath. He reached the service corridor, found the maintenance door he'd arranged to leave unlocked days earlier, and vanished into the hotel's lower levels before security could seal the exits behind him. By the time investigators finished collecting the shattered remains of Dong-Yul's champagne glass from the ballroom floor, most of the guests had already been escorted out, wrapped in hotel blankets and murmuring theories that would circulate through Seoul's wealthiest circles for weeks. Kate sat in a private room off the kitchens, still soaked, wrapped in a towel someone had thrown over her shoulders without ceremony, waiting to learn whether she was about to be arrested or simply forgotten. She was neither. The laboratory results arrived before dawn, and they explained, finally, the second half of what had happened in that ballroom. The champagne Dong-Yul had lifted to his lips carried a fast-acting cardiac toxin, engineered to mimic a stress-induced heart attack. No bullet required, no evidence to trace, nothing but a tragic collapse at his own celebration. The sniper had only ever been the contingency. Kate's water hadn't simply made Dong-Yul duck beneath a bullet meant for his throat. It had knocked the poisoned glass from his hand before a single drop reached him. She had saved his life twice, in the same 3 seconds, without understanding either threat at the time. Dong-Yul found her still sitting in that back room hours later, the towel still around her shoulders, and said nothing for a long moment before he spoke. "You knew," he said, "about the poison too. I recognized the symptoms in the waiter who touched the tray," Kate said. "I didn't have time to explain that part. I only had time to stop you from drinking it." Investigators, working through the night, uncovered the rest. The forged messages under Kate's name had been posted from her phone during precisely the 20 minutes it had gone missing from the staff break room. Han proved it by timestamp, cross-referenced against security footage no one had thought to check until now. The 12-second recording still saved on Kate's phone, garbled and incomplete as it was, matched the timeline closely enough to corroborate her account instead of contradicting it, and Han added it to the file without comment. That same footage showed Park Jin-suk, in the seconds after the gunshot, standing perfectly still and watching Dong-Yul rather than moving to protect him. The one man, in the entire ballroom whose reaction gave away everything his composure had spent years concealing. Dong-Yul moved Kate and her mother to a secured property outside the city that same night, unwilling to risk a second attempt on either of their lives while Park remained free. It was there, in a quiet room with better locks than her apartment had ever had, that Kate finally opened the pendant her father had given her years earlier, the one he'd told her, in the same breath as his final warning, never to remove. She had always assumed it was sentiment, a keepsake, a small gold shape to remember him by. Inside, soldered into the setting so carefully, it had survived over a decade against her skin, without her ever suspecting, was a miniature storage device, no larger than a grain of rice. It was, once connected to the encrypted file Dong-Yul had carried for years, exactly what he had been missing all along. Not a second copy of the data, but the very key that finally made the file readable. The file unlocked slowly, line by line, into a list of names that read like a roster of the country's most trusted institutions. Politicians, judges, senior executives, police officials, all of them threaded through Kang Tae-sik's decade of smuggling and laundering, with the precision only a trained auditor could have documented. Samuel Harte had not simply discovered a crime. He had built, piece by piece, the exact instrument required to prove it, and hidden the only key to using it around his daughter's neck. Dong-Yul wanted to release it immediately. Prosecutor Yoon argued against it, calling from a number that changed every few hours. If the ledger went public before she could coordinate simultaneous warrants, she told them, half the names on that list would be gone within the hour, and the other half would have time to destroy whatever evidence still connected them to Kang directly. She needed 2 days. Reluctantly, Dong-Yul agreed to wait, and had one of his engineers load the completed file onto a small transmitter built into a plain wristband, something Kate could wear without question, something that would send everything the moment its hidden switch was triggered, in case 2 days became too long to survive. Kang and Park learned the ledger had been unlocked within hours, funneled to them through the same channels Park had spent months quietly building inside Dong-Yul's own operation. What Kate learned, 2 days later, standing in a hospital corridor with a bouquet for her mother still in her hands, was that a car had pulled alongside her outside the entrance, and that everything went dark before she understood what was happening at all. She would only piece together afterward, from what Han told her once it was over, that Kang had chosen, with deliberate cruelty, to summon Dong-Yul to the exact same abandoned shipping port where Samuel Harte had been murdered years before. Dong-Yul, informed within minutes and refusing to wait for backup, had also given a single order before he left. Evelyn Harte was to be moved under guard to a hospital wing Kang's people had no way of finding, and kept there, safe, for as long as it took. Kate woke in a warehouse that smelled of rust and salt water, wrists bound to a chair beneath a single hanging light, and understood immediately that she had come, at last, to the place where all of this had actually begun. Kang Tae-sik entered like a man arriving at a business meeting, immaculate, at ease, a jade ring catching the dim light as he studied her with something almost like curiosity. "Your father sat exactly where you're sitting," he said, conversational, as though remarking on the weather. He believed truth could defeat power. A romantic idea. Wrong, obviously, but I've always admired the commitment. He crouched slightly, bringing his calm eyes level with hers. "You have something I've spent years looking for." Park arrived soon after, less composed than Kate had ever seen him, already negotiating for his own survival before Dong-Yul had even entered the building. "I can get you the pendant," he said quickly, to Kang, not to Kate. "I can explain everything about how the sniper failed. Just let me—" He didn't finish, because Dong-Yul stepped through the warehouse doors at that moment, the folder visibly in hand, appearing to every eye in the room, to have surrendered before the confrontation had even begun. What none of them saw was Kate's bound hands, working quietly at the wristband hidden beneath her sleeve, her thumb finding the small switch by feel alone. The transmission began silently, threading the completed ledger toward Prosecutor Yoon, and a list of international newsrooms Dong-Yul had prepared weeks earlier, precisely for a moment like this one. Park noticed the small light blinking at Kate's wrist, a beat before Kang did, and in that beat, his careful composure finally collapsed entirely. "She's sending it," he said, voice cracking upward. "Right now, she's—" Kang didn't wait to hear the rest. He turned and shot Park where he stood, the sound cracking flat and enormous through the warehouse, and Park folded to the concrete without another word, a lifetime of careful calculation ending in less than a second of consequence. Kang turned the weapon toward Kate next. Dong-Yul moved before the shot could land, closing the distance in 2 strides and driving the gun upward and away, the 2 men grappling in the half-light until the weapon clattered free across the concrete floor, and Dong-Yul came up holding it, breathing hard, Kang forced to his knees in front of him. For a long moment, nobody in the warehouse moved. Kate watched Dong-Yul's finger settle against the trigger, watched 11 years of guilt and grief, and inherited violence gather behind his eyes, and understood that he was about to do the one thing that would undo everything either of them had risked to get to this room. "If you kill him," she said, her voice low but unwavering, "his empire survives inside you." She held his gaze across the warehouse floor, soaked in her father's memory as much as her own fear. You'll spend the rest of your life being exactly what you were trying to destroy. Dong-Yul's hand did not move for 3 long seconds. Then, slowly, the weapon lowered. Han and the prosecution team breached the warehouse doors moments later, drawn by the gunshot and the released ledger already blooming across 6 newsrooms' inboxes, and Kang Tae-sik was taken into custody without another word spoken in his own defense. By morning, the released evidence had triggered a wave of arrests across the country, officials resigning before charges could be filed, others taken from their homes in the same gray daylight that found Kate back at the hospital, her mother's hand in hers, watching the news scroll across a waiting room television, with her father's name finally spoken aloud, in a sentence that didn't end in suspicion. Dong-Yul called a press conference 8 days later, and the country that had spent a decade fearing him watched, in near total silence, as he did something no one expected a man like him to survive doing. He confirmed the organization's existence in his own voice. He admitted his own responsibility, named the corrupt officials who had shielded it for years, and announced the transfer of every legitimate Nae company into an independent trust beyond his own control. Then, in front of every camera in the room, he turned and bowed to Kate, not the brief, formal bow of courtesy, but a long, deliberate one, low enough to silence the room completely, before straightening to tell the country that the woman beside him had saved not only his life, but whatever remained of his conscience. He surrendered to the authorities that same afternoon. Kate did not return to the invisible corners of hotel corridors after that. She spent the following months establishing the Samuel Hart Foundation, funded from what remained of the Nae family's legitimate holdings, built to support the people her father's death and her own silence had once taught her to overlook, exploited hospitality workers, migrant employees far from home, whistleblowers with nowhere left to turn, families still living in the wreckage, organized crime always left behind it. She refused, at first, to accept the role of director, uneasy at the thought of building anything from Dong-Yul's ruin. She accepted only once the foundation's board was placed entirely outside his influence, and only once she understood that her father would have wanted the work continued, not memorialized. She returned to school not long after, finishing the emergency medicine qualification she'd abandoned years earlier, studying now in the early mornings, before foundation meetings, instead of between exhausting hotel shifts. On the day the foundation's headquarters formally opened, Kate carried a single silver water pitcher into the building's front display case herself, setting it beneath a small brass plaque she had written the words for on the night she signed the foundation's charter. "Courage does not always arrive with a weapon," it read. "Sometimes it arrives carrying water. If this story stayed with you, subscribe for more like it, and tell me in the comments which moment hit you hardest, the water, the confession, or the bow. I read every one, and I would love to say hello to you there too."